welcome to the
I
ninth,
watched in Russian.
in my opinion, one of the
Seeing
best. Our regular viewers and listeners will be surprised that today it's not an economist or a political scientist or somebody who speaks about geopolitics for a living. No, today we have a historian, and not just any historian. I'm very pleased to have Robert Darnton, an expert and excellent writer on the French Revolution, but of course his knowledge and expertise goes beyond this. He was a professor of history at Harvard. I think you're now a professor emeritus, if I'm not mistaken, but his writings and his knowledge still resonates. I came across his work, I have to admit, listening to the Rest is History podcast on the French Revolution. And they spoke so highly and quoted so often from Professor Darton's book that I said, oh man, I have to take a look at this myself. And I have to admit, they did not oversell, at best they did undersell it. So, and one of the first questions I would like to put to you, Professor, is, very often books about revolutions deal with the revolution and maybe a little bit about what happened before. But in your book, what you're exploring is what was the zeitgeist, the collective experience at the time that then led up to the revolution itself. And what I would like to ask you, the title of the book is The Revolutionary Temper. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you mean by this? How did the title emerge, and what are you describing in your book?
Well, the phrase revolutionary temper may sound a little bit unusual. I emphasize it because it's not simply a book about public opinion. It's a book about the formation of a collective mentality, an outlook on the direction of affairs that spread everywhere in Paris. So it is something that Durkheim called the collective consciousness. Now, that sounds a little vague and it's hard to pin down, but what I do in the book is not to assume that we have a clear line of causality leading to the revolution, but rather to look upon Paris in the middle of the 18th century as an information society, to try to trace the way information actually flowed and to show how the media of the time actually operated. So it's not as if the French Revolution is looming over the horizon. On the contrary, it's an attempt to show how people experienced events and how they made sense of them. So it's a different kind of history. It's a sort of event history dealing with collective consciousness. Now, that's a big word, but what I try to do is to recount episodes in a way that I hope the reader will find interesting, but in a way that gets across the actual nature of the flow of information. So you've heard it said 100 times, we live in an information society. And my point is that every society is an information society, each in its own way and according to the media available at the time. So that's what I'm trying to show.
The term you just used, like collective consciousness, I have to ask, in your own experience, is this something you may have experienced pushback on? And the reason why I'm asking this is in our somewhat individualistic age, right? The idea is a Hayekian, for example. I mean, I'm Austrian, not necessarily a follower of the Austrian School of Economics, but the Hayek school would say, oh no, right? There is no such thing as a collective consciousness. It's individuals that just happen to interact, and then it might appear as such, but in the end of the day, everything is individualistic. And have you experienced kind of pushback on this idea of a collective consciousness? Or was it
Well,
difficult to argue?
and I wish I had, because it's a fascinating idea and we should have a debate about it. But frankly, no, I've not seen anyone challenging the notion of collective consciousness. I mean, for example, you could say the same thing about society. Does society exist? We are only individuals, but we use the word society as if it were a real thing. Well, it is real. Society does exist and it has a collective consciousness. But I agree that that can seem abstruse. And the point of my book is to show how it actually operates, to give instances and to analyze the instances in a way that I hope will make sense to current readers.
I mean, you give a fascinating depiction of Parisian society and the information flow in Parisian society and the almost, I would say, modern character the city had at the time. You talk, for example, about special places, special trees. Unfortunately, my French is so horrible that I would not dare to say it because I would butcher the entire conversation. But where people exchanged ideas and how also rumors were spreading, and so it's truly very modern. It seems that nowadays maybe things spread quicker because of the internet and everything, but the design or the role of gossip and all these things. Now let me ask you, when we look, and you describe this quite nicely in your book, when we look at the different social classes that existed, so who participated in all of this? Was it just a phenomenon in the upper class or middle class phenomenon? Or would it be fair to say that in one way or another, the literate, the illiterate, but everybody one way or another participated in this exchange of information and participated in the happenings of the day, if you want?
Yes. Well, I think everyone did participate in the exchange of information, but in a different way. It was a highly hierarchical society, even though in Paris things were much more fluid than they were in the provinces. But uh, this is a world without newspapers. The first daily newspaper in Paris only dates from 1777, and it was highly censored. So there are no newspapers, there's no television, no internet, none of the modern media. And yet you've got a system of information that is extraordinarily active and powerful. So, how could, for example, the illiterate find out about things? I begin the book in actually 1747 at the end of the War of the Austrian Succession, and I ask, how did ordinary people, even illiterate people, know what was going on? Well, obviously, not by reading the newspapers. There were no newspapers and they couldn't read. But the last battle of um, the War of the Austrian Succession, the Battle of Lauffeld, uh, it took place in 1747, July 2nd. The French expelled the British troops from the small village of Lauffeld, and Louis XV, who did not command the French troops, but he was present as a witness, sat down and dictated a letter to a page who got on a horse, galloped to Versailles. It took him 2.5 days changing horses and announced a great French victory, reading the king's letter, which I print in the book. But then information began to arrive on the following days from the commanders of individual divisions and corps, and they actually mentioned an enormous number of killed and wounded on the French side. And so the Parisians began to say, what is it to win a battle if we've lost so many men? Then foreign newspapers in French arrived, and they described the number of dead. On the French side, 80,000. On the British side, 20,000. And they said that the British troops withdrew, but to a very powerful formation uh, near Maastricht, uh, so that they could actually stop the French invasion. And then there were various other things. So the French began to say, well, we won the battlefield, but they won the battle. And this rumor began to spread around and around. And then after the truce announces the peace. And the Peace of Aix-la-Chapelle is another event that might seem outside the uh, apprehension of illiterate people. But you've got the gossip already. Maybe we lost the last battle. And then the truce is published Now, what does it mean to publish something in a pre-literate society or semi-literate society? Well, it is published by a parade. There are 800 men get on horses, they put on grand costumes, they parade around Paris, they stop at 13 places, a trumpets blow, a herald announces that peace has been restored and people can uh, treat the English as non-enemies. Then there's a great banquet. And after the banquet, there are fireworks and there is free wine and bread and sausages in all of the major neighborhoods of Paris. So the ordinary people know about this, and it all comes to a climax at the fireworks after the dancing in the streets. The fireworks go off, and in the crush afterwards, people trip and fall over one another, and several people are trampled to death. Then, in the next day, we have reports that ordinary people, fishmongers in the marketplace, when they fight and get in a quarrel, say to one another as an insult, "You are as stupid as the peace. Tu es bête comme la paix." So that's an example of how something that seems to be very remote, a battle and an act of diplomacy, a peace treaty, actually penetrates down into the world of ordinary people and they know about it. So that my point is that ordinary people, illiterate people, do have an interest in public affairs. They don't just go about their work. They are curious about the world around them, but they don't, of course, have exposure to newspapers or modern media. And so I give several other examples of this. If you like, I could cite another example.
Please do, please do.
There was, after the next war, the war of the 7 Years' War, which ended in 1763, there were new taxes. And the government tried to win over public opinion by pamphlets. So they hired pamphleteers to make a case in favor of the new taxes. Now, one of these pamphlets is read aloud outside the Café du Foy in the middle of Paris in the garden of the Palais Royal. So a huge crowd gathers to hear the pamphlet being read aloud. But it's not just read, it's acted out. So the reader has a deep voice. He goes on for about a half an hour. And the crowd, which is hostile to the government, interrupts with boos and whistles and so on. There's a lot of interaction. Then they take the pamphlet, they put it on a table, and they name a prosecuting attorney, a judge, a confessor, and a public executioner. They accuse the pamphlet of the crime of despotism. They convict it, and then a waiter from the cafe, who is the public executioner, burns it publicly, and everyone cheers. So there's a huge ingredient of theatricality in this. You not only do you get a printed pamphlet read aloud, but there's a scene and acting out of people's feelings. And I see that happening all the time in the streets of Paris, especially at certain sites where information came together at kind of nerve centers. And I mentioned several of those in the course of the book as well.
It almost appears that there is an element of, I guess, nowadays we would call it infotainment to it. As you say, it's not just
Yes.
the reading of it, there is actually some interaction. And maybe you could talk a little bit about, it seems to me also the two examples you just used, that there was also a very fine sense of humor, also in the theatrical, or if you want, the absurd, to enact something and thereby voice criticism, opposition. Maybe you can talk about this a little bit. So how can we, when we try to recreate the scene in a Parisian cafe at the time, what should we imagine? What is fiction, and what do you think is, how did it really take place?
Well, of course, the people who went to cafes were relatively well off. So we're talking about the middle class, the upper classes. And this is where gossip occurred. So one example might be gossip that begins in the tree of Krakow. Now, there was an actual tree, an oak tree, at the northern part of the gardens of the Palais Royal in the center of Paris. And that's where nouvellistes de bouche, that is, people who are interested in news, but oral news, all gathered. If you wanted to find out what was happening and you were curious about public affairs, you went to this tree. Everyone gathered around it. And it was so important that ambassadors would send agents to find out what was happening or to plant information in favor of their countries. So the Nouvellistes would sometimes take notes, and then they would go to the cafe and they would have a note that they would put in their sleeves or their waistcoat pockets. They take it out, they read it, or they exchange it for a note by someone else. And you've got these little bits of paper scribbled with information that was heard at the Tree of Krakow. And then sometimes nouvelliste newsmongers would gather together the notes and write a little, in effect, gazette based on them. And these gazettes, called Gazette à la main, or manuscript newspapers, would circulate secretly under the cloak, as people said, and they were uninhibited in their discussion of public affairs. Then sometimes these manuscript gazettes would be sent to the Netherlands or to Switzerland and printed, and they would come back in printed form. So you can follow information as it moves from an oral discussion to a manuscript news sheet, and then finally printed books, which turn out to be bestsellers. So again, what you've got is mixed media, the transfer of information from one kind of communication to another. And it's not just printed or manuscript words, it's also sung words. So I have a section of the book about street songs, because although Paris didn't have newspapers, not everyone, but many people every day improvise new words to old tunes. And the Parisians carry in their heads a collective repertory of tunes, of melodies, just as we do today. I mean, you and I probably share certain melodies that we know, sometimes from commercials or popular songs. I've done a study of all of the melodies that existed at the mid 18th century because they are recorded in manuscript collections called chansonniers, or song books. And some of them are enormous. There's one called the Chansonnier Clérambault that has 58 huge folio volumes. And another one in the Bibliothèque historique de la ville de Paris has 641 songs just for 5 years in the middle of the 18th century. So I've been through all of these, and these are written out. They write out the lyrics to the songs, but they always say sung to the tune of, and they give the name of the tune. I did statistics and so on as to the names of tunes that appeared most often, and it became clear to me that there were about 20 tunes that everyone would have known in mid 18th century Paris. Then I went to the musicology department of the Bibliothèque Nationale de France and got the actual musical annotation. A friend of mine, Hélène Delaveau, who is a cabaret singer in Paris, recorded the tunes and the songs that were written, the words that were written at the time. So it's as if you can hear the past, not perfectly, but still, once you hear a words written to a popular tune as they more or less were sung at the time, it creates a tremendous effect. And we know that, for example, that it was April 24th, 1749, the most powerful minister of the government fell, was dismissed, disgraced. Why? All of the contemporary evidence says the same thing. Because of songs. Songs were powerful. And every day you've got a new song being sung in the streets. There were street singers who did this as a way to make money, but people sung at work. And the songs are about current events. So the air of Paris is full of music about news. And in the case of the fall of this minister, the Comte de Maurepas, we have a lot of contemporary information about it. And so I devote a chapter to this, but I'll just tell you briefly. It turned out that there was an incident in the private apartments of the king in Versailles, known as the Petits Appartements. And it was a dinner which Louis XV, Maurepas, the powerful minister, Madame du Barry, the king's mistress, and her cousin, Madame d'Estrades, just the four had dinner. So Madame du Barry appears for dinner, and she gives 4 white hyacinth flowers to the others. It's a kind of grand gesture, if you like. Well, the next day, a song circulates, and well, I'll say it very briefly. If I don't want to bore you, I can't sing it, but my friend Hélène Delaveau does sing it. It goes as follows. Par vos façons nobles et franches, Iris, vous enchantez nos cœurs. Sur nos pas, vous semez des fleurs, mais ce sont des fleurs blanches. By your noble manners, Iris, you enchant our hearts. On our paths, you sow flowers, but they are white flowers. Now, this was so outrageous that Maurepas was dismissed from the government and exiled. It was a big political event.
Why was it outrageous?
To us today, you know, you probably didn't see anything wrong with that at all. It sounds rather gallant. In fact, white flowers, fleur, was an allusion to venereal disease that the king's mistress passed on to him. And so the song says, Madame du Barry, Madame de Pompadour gave the king VD, and that was too much. But only Maurepas could have known this, and so he was dismissed. Now, that's a long explanation, but it's an example of the way something that is simply oral could spread everywhere and actually have a political effect. Of course, things were more complicated than that. There were all kinds of political intrigues, but the occasion for the collapse of the most powerful ministry in the middle of the 18th century in 1749 was a song.
And it shows that they were not isolated from public sentiment.
Yes, that's right, because This song, in this case, began in Versailles, but it spread all
Mm.
over the place because it was funny, it was shocking, and it was easy to remember and repeat or sing. So it has a power. You know, songs have a mnemonic power, they stick
Mm.
in your memory. If you already know the tune and you have new words, it works beautifully as a means of communication.
Is and at what point did the let's say that the ruling class, the ruling elites, at one point did they realize that there is an increased public interest in politics, or that as you just said, down to the fishmongers at the Parisian rivers, and
Yes.
how did they react to it? How did they try to react to it?
Well, it's hard to say that there was a particular point, a
Mm.
certain instant. I think it's a cumulative sense of threat. But the information that reached the people in power came through an actual network, uh, namely the police. Now, the word police means something different in the 18th century. It really means rational administration.
Mm.
And the lieutenant general of police really basically runs Paris, handles a lot of the services. So he has, uh, we think, 3,000 spies. That is, people who go around to the Tree of Krakow, to certain benches in the Palais, in the Luxembourg Gardens or the Tuileries Gardens. The spies go to marketplaces, certain street corners, the Pont Neuf, which is a great center for gathering crowds, and they listen to what people are saying. They write reports, they send them to the secretary of the lieutenant general, who writes a sort of a compilation of the news from the spies and inspectors. There are several specialized inspectors, police inspectors, and a bulletin is prepared for the minister of Paris, who is part of the king's household in
Mm.
Versailles. And the minister then reads it, and he reads it to the king. Now, of course, it's uh, filtered at every stage. They don't want the king to hear the most horrible things, but a lot of even the rumors reach him. And along the way, the head of the police force is informed about growing sentiments of hostility, not exactly to the crown, but to ministers, to mistresses, to certain key players in the power system, which is Versailles. So I think this awareness of hostility increases over time, and you can see it especially after certain episodes. One episode is the famous Flour War of 1775. Bread was the main item in most people's diet. So if the price of bread goes up, uh, it's a dangerous thing. There are bread riots scattered throughout the century. And in the summer of 1775, the price of bread went up. The normal price for a 4 pound loaf was 8 sous. It was as high as 14 sous. And people were furious and hungry, ready to riot. And in fact, they did riot. They took Paris for several days, and I think it was 3,000 bakeries were looted. So there's an explosion of popular anger. It's later called the Flour War. Uh, well, this very much shook up the government, and there was a kind of investigation. Some rioters were hanged, but it became clear through the reports that eventually reached Versailles that there was a lot of anger and resentment directed against the monarchy
Mm.
because there was a concept of a just price for bread, and a rumor spread that there were speculators who were keeping bread uh, in store so that they could sell it at a high price when the price reached a peak, and that some of these speculators were aristocrats in Versailles and even the king himself. There was a so-called famine plot, complot de famine. And so the king is implicated in this, and as are the ministers and so on. So that's an example of how the regime becomes aware of a growing sentiment, widespread public sentiment. That's my dog. A widespread public sentiment of hatred, resentment, a sense that the regime itself is unjust.
Do you think that this then contributed from the temper being public interest moving into more and more becoming a revolutionary temper?
Yes, I think that, if I follow it closely through these manuscript gazettes I mentioned, through correspondence, through journals that people keep, through reports in the foreign press, the Gazette de l'Aide, for example. The sources are really very rich. Um, and so you can see things becoming more and more violent and dramatic. It's a violent society. I mean, there are public hangings all the time. So, yes, there is a sense of a temperature that is increasing, and it then breaks out in actual riots and violence. So, the flower war is one example, but then there are many more. And finally, when the crown is effectively bankrupt, because the financing of the American Revolution just broke the financial system of the crown. When it faces bankruptcy, it's forced to try to raise new taxes. That fails. And finally, it's forced to call the Estates General. But along the way, there are a series of episodes accompanied by violence. And I give examples of this, but you can study the violence itself because, violence is not just brute force breaking out, it's also theatrical in its own way. It has patterns. People behave in accustomed kinds of riots, which often are uh, derived in a sense from Mardi Gras and
Ah,
carnival. So there's a carnivalesque idiom to violence. And for example, first in August and then in September 1788, two key ministers that tried to raise money to avoid bankruptcy and failed and were overthrown. Uh, these ministers are mocked through public ceremonies. That is, the crowd in the center of Paris uh, builds mannequins, straw men, enormous straw men, decorates them with wigs and costumes that indicate the ministers, and then they parade them around the center of Paris. They make them kneel in front of the statue of Henry IV on the Pont Neuf because he's considered to be a friend of the common people. It's to beg forgiveness. They bring them back near the Palais de Justice. They put them on trial, again, a popular trial with an attorney general, a confessor, a judge, and a hangman. They declare the straw men guilty and they burn them in enormous fires. And then the police has to intervene because people are so excited and they kill a few people, then the people fight back. And finally, in the riots of September 1788, you got 80 people killed and workers from the Faubourg Saint Antoine and Saint Marcel joining in the fighting. So Paris is dissolving into chaos. By the end of 1788, before the supreme chaos of the spring of 1789 and the taking of the Bastille. So you can see the development of this collective anger that takes the form of violence, but violence that is acted out in a way that the carnivalesque idiom that everyone understands.
Now, I don't mean to force you out of your comfort zone, so you can refuse to answer this question, but I would invite you to speculate a little bit. Now, given your experience with the pre-revolutionary events and public sentiment in 18th century France, do you think in particularly in the West, whether in Europe or the United States, that there is a manifestation, nothing is ever the same, but of potentially similar trends? Of anger, of the
Well,
theatrical, if you
yeah,
want.
no need to tell you that we are undergoing a major crisis in the United States today. Uh, you read about it every day in the
Mhm.
newspapers, but we have newspapers, we have television, we have the internet. These are different kinds of media. Uh, and in a way, they're more dangerous because of what we call the silo effect. That is to say, people on the extreme right, Trump backers in the Midwest in particular, read only blogs and internet messages uh, of people they already agree with. And they certainly don't read the New York Times or even the Wall Street Journal. So they're enclosed within a sub information system peculiar to them, whereas people on the East Coast and now in California are have their own separate media of information. It's no longer the case that certain television news programs reached everyone. No, you've got a kind of um, breakup of a general system of information. And that, I think, feeds the polarization of an extreme right. And well, we don't have really an extreme left, but you have a lot of very angry anti Trump people. And they are demonstrating in the streets of Los Angeles today. In fact, later today, there will be a first round of demonstrations all over the country and on Saturday, enormous demonstrations. Yes, we've got people taking to the streets, not exactly as they did in 18th century Paris, but there is the spread, I think, of a dangerously hostile environment. Uh, and that's more in among the anti-Trump people, but there's a lot of anger and hostility on the part of Trump's supporters. So it's a dangerous situation. And now that we've got troops called out, the actual Marines, as well as the National Guard in the streets of Los Angeles, uh, that's dynamite. It's a very dangerous thing. The troops are not supposed to be used for domestic affairs. And so it's a sort of militarization in dealing with collective protest. I think it's very dangerous indeed. So it's similar. We've got the development of I wouldn't call it a revolutionary temper, but certainly a threat of despotism, uh, which is a kind of echo of the threat of despotism as it was perceived in Paris in the 18th century.
If I look at political developments both in the United States and in Europe at the moment, there seems to be one overlap between both the let's say that the left fringe and the right fringe. If I, let's say, for example, compare Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, right, which on a first glance might seem absurd, but this idea that there is and there might be something to it. So I'm not judging the idea, but it's just that it's out there. Whether it's true or not is for somebody else to come to a conclusion about that. But that there is an elite conspiracy, right? That there are so many populists, again, both left and right, that maybe justifiably, so maybe not, they claim to speak for the masses, for the nation, right? Which for me at least resonates a little bit with the idea of some of the French revolutionaries, right? You have the king, which was quote unquote the elite of the day, the aristocracy, and then there was the patrie, the nation, and they were not represented by the ruling classes. And I'm sure, or correct me if I'm wrong, or actually I'm asking you, the French revolutionaries, were they all pulling in the same direction, or were there actually very different factions? And could we
Yeah.
say, I mean, the very term left and right wing, if I'm not mistaken, derives from this period of French history.
Well, yes, the very phrases left and right come from the seating of the National Assembly in 1789, where the deputies actually sat to the left or to the right of the speaker. Um, there were lots of different opinions. There were lots of issues. The ideological landscape was very complicated.
Mm.
So uh, you can trace expressions of views all over a very broad spectrum. However, what I think was going on, especially in the late 1780s, was what I call radical simplification.
Mm.
That this complex set of opinions about lots of subjects somehow is reduced to a sense of hostility toward the government, toward the ministers. The word for it is ministerial despotism. So it's not trying to overthrow the king, but it's a sense that the system itself is rotten, is
But
corrupt,
that
is
sounds
decadent.
very contemporary.
Yes, but what happens, I think, is that I've traced different forms of public opinion through people like Condorcet.
Mm-hmm.
Condorcet favors the government, which has some good reform ideas in 1788. In many ways, the government is progressive, but it's not perceived as being progressive. It is perceived as being despotic. And Condorcet at first he writes pamphlets in favor of the government. But after these episodes of violence and the extreme repression that I mentioned, 80 people killed in a street battles in September 1788, Condorcet changes and uh, takes sides with the anti-government
Mm.
forces. That's what I mean by radical simplification. Even someone like Condorcet, very sophisticated in his views, comes around to this fundamental notion, that the enemy is the government. And that notion, it's a deep feeling of illegitimacy. I think a regime is in serious trouble when it loses its legitimacy. And the loss of legitimacy is something we are experiencing, I think, today in the United
Yes.
States.
I think not just in the United States. I mean, this is the problem of the European Union and many European states as well. So
Yeah.
when we stick, I think Condorcet is a wonderful historical figure, maybe to pin this down a little bit. So what do you think made, like, was it then a deep change of conviction, or was it just that he felt that if he wants to play a role, he has to adapt to the spirit of the age, to the zeitgeist? What do you think triggered that switch from reformer to revolutionary, if you want?
Of course, in American slang, we talk about gut reactions, a
Mm.
sort of visceral conviction to things. It's not philosophical, it's emotional. And I think one thing that historians need to do is to deal with the emotional power of communication. Uh, that is to say, messages are playing on people's feelings and igniting anger, fear, hatred. I can see all of this happening in 18th century Paris. It's vivid. It's not something made up by me. There's lots and lots of testimony to this. Now, I think something similar is going on now. And it is, I think, quite dangerous. Now, has it reached the point where you can talk about a revolutionary temper? I don't think so.
Hmm.
But if we have the military in the streets of Los Angeles and other cities, and if there are a series of incidents in which soldiers kill civilians, that's very grave. And in fact, as you probably know, Trump has changed the leadership at the top of the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. He has his own men in command. So, if things spin out of control, I could see a very dangerous situation developing. Will it happen? I have no idea. But one thing that I've learned, I think, in studying this development in 18th century France is the importance of contingency,
Hmm.
of unforeseen consequences. Uh, so things can go wrong in a very serious way. But I don't want to sound alarmist. I mean, this country has an old tradition, it has a vast uh, judicial system. There are all kinds of people with interests in preserving a kind of normatively uh, healthy society, including businessmen and old fashioned Republicans, as opposed to Trump fanatics.
Is it also a little bit then the interpretation of events? If we go back to the French Revolution, the storm of the Bastille. I mean, it's very interesting. Or let me ask you: do you think that the 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 way at the time and also now historically, very often the storm of the Bastille is described and how these events are remembered, if you want, or how we desire to remember them, is not necessarily entirely in line with what actually happened.
That's right. Of course, the storming of the Bastille becomes a myth almost
Yeah.
instantly. Uh, uh, Soon after July 14th, 1789, the Bastille is taken apart stone by stone, and the stones are sometimes sculpted and sold, and they circulate as monuments to despotism. So you can see the myth actually taking form uh, in the days after July 14th. In the days before, no, I don't think the French believed when they uh, assaulted the Bastille that they were creating a revolution. They were reacting to the dismissal of the main minister, Necker, uh, who for them represented a kind of decency, an attempt to hold back military repression, and to side with the people in the Estates General. So uh, I, it's not as if suddenly people are saying, let's make a revolution and take the Bastille. It's a reaction to a particular event, the dismissal of Necker, and you can see how it actually happens. It happens again in the garden of the Palais Royal, where Desmoulins climbs on a table and he says, "Aux armes, citoyens," take arms, citizens. Um, it's similar to what was going on in the same place outside the Café de Foix in the instances I mentioned, going all the way back to 1748 and further. So they are acting out in a theatrical way um, a situation that conforms to patterns in the past. They're not understanding that they're about to create a revolution of unprecedented dimensions. So that's why I would emphasize uh, unforeseen consequences, contingency, a pattern that's derived from the past, which is going to break open a future that no one can see clearly.
Do you think, as one of my final questions, I know we're already over time, but it's just too fascinating the conversation. Do you think the revolution made the revolutionaries, or the revolutionaries made the revolution? Meaning, was was there intent that led to the event, or was there more of intent that led to the events, or were there events that then, in hindsight, we say, "Oh, this was the intention, or these were the main actors"? Like, did they consciously guide the events, or were they just thrown in the midst of it and rose, if you want, on the wave then of the political change that took place?
Well, I do not see evidence of an intention to create a revolution. In fact, the very concept of revolution, the word revolution often evoked to revolve, to go around in cycles. Sometimes it's used for dramatic political change, but it doesn't carry the power that the word has today. So I don't think there were people intending to overthrow the throne and to create this thing, a revolution at all. There were leaders, of course, but there had been leaders in riots going way back in time. There were ideologues. There was a huge debate in pamphlets and then new newspapers, because by the spring of 1789, uncensored pamphlets and newspapers appeared. So there's another wave of information, a politicization, yes, but people are, I don't know of individuals who are meaning to storm the Bastille, and I've studied lots of individual uh, characters who will become revolutionaries. Even someone like Marat, a wild revolutionary, is not thinking of creating a revolution before July 14th. So no, I think that the revolutionary mentality, in the sense of Jacobinism, is
Hmm.
something that is created over time, and that you need to look very carefully at the events of the revolution beyond July 14th, 1789. Many things happened. The great peasant revolts in that summer, the civil constitution of the clergy, so the church is involved, um, and later the sense of threat of the common people of Paris through their sections of Paris. Finally, the key thing, in my opinion, is the war in the spring of 1792, when France is fighting the old regimes of the rest of Europe while trying to, control the price of bread and manage uh, revolts at home in all of the major cities outside Paris. So the conditions are dramatically different by the time of the overthrow of the monarchy on August 10th, 1792, not to mention the terror that follows. So
So
I
that
see a process of radicalization rather than the beginning of a revolution which is understood and intended even before July 14th.
So the early French Revolution doesn't have, for lack of a better comparison, it doesn't have a Lenin, so to speak. Somebody who intended the revolution, the overthrow of the ancien regime, and to build something entirely new.
That's right. But you've got the development with this enormous pamphlet literature and street orators and
Mm.
so on of a sense that the uh, regime is illegitimate, that it's corrupt, it's decadent, it's alienated from the people, and that the people themselves, the nation, should be represented in the Estates General. Now, that set of uh, beliefs and attitudes is quite radical. Um, it's not revolutionary until you've got the violence and the transfer of actual power into the hands of the third estate, which becomes the National Assembly.
So as my last question, probably the most important one, if you, as a historian of no, not just the French Revolution, but generally a historian of many of the key events of continental European, of Western history. And somebody would ask you point blank, so what do you think was the significance of the French Revolution? I know it's an unfair question because probably this would be another hour. But if you're gonna just from the, as we just said, from the emotional, from the gut side, how would your
Yes.
answer to that question be?
Well, okay, I will spontaneously, without a lot of reflection, say it's the conviction that the common people can make history instead of simply suffering it.
But that's a wonderful way to put it. And then, of course, I have to ask a final, more, actually, even more important question. Do you think, and I hope the answer is yes, is the French Revolution still worthwhile studying? Like, should we still look at it? Should we still engage with it? Are there lessons for the contemporary world to be drawn from the events of 18th century France?
Well, of course, it's a key event in modern history. You must study it and restudy it. It is reinterpreted conditionally, continuously. My own, so to speak, reinterpretation is to emphasize the role of information as a factor, which I think has not been adequately understood before. But I draw on the all the writing about the old regime and the revolution. So it's of enormous importance. But I don't think we can learn from history in the sense of taking lessons that from one context
Mm.
that can be applied to another context. No, I think what we learn is uh, a matter of perspective to see how a regime can fall apart, be overthrown, how a new regime can be constructed and contested. I mean, these are all deep historical processes that are deeply instructive, but they don't give us direct lessons for the present, because the present it's really a, a different world. So I think we should all study the French Revolution and other revolutions, including the American Revolution and the Soviet Revolution. Uh, the study is terribly important, but it's not going to give us nicely packaged
Mm.
lessons that we can unpack and consume and then understand things.
Well, on that note, Professor Darnton, thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
Well, thank you for inviting me.